Thank you for joining us. We have been seeing some big disruptions in the global supply chains these past few years, and I've invited Dave Kelley and Bob Jones to share areas of importance for supply chains today and to share what's on their mind regarding focus areas that businesses should care about right now. And if you don't know me, I'm Jana Panfilio, co-founder of 6453 Alumni. Let me start with Dave. Dave worked for Nike for 24 years in a variety of roles, from sports marketing to team sales, footwear, materials management, Asia manufacturing, product creation, and geography distribution, ending in ManRev before retiring in 28. He started Zefyr in 2019, and with Bob, they have established Zefyr Consulting as the go-to solution for any supply chain needs in the footwear and apparel industry. Bob Jones is a seasonal professional with 24 years experience at Nike, where he held various roles in planning, sourcing, manufacturing, quality, engineering, and innovation. With a proven track record of success, Bob believes they have invaluable expertise in apparel and footwear to share with the industry. So I'm going to just turn it over to Dave and Bob to kind of talk a little bit about Zefyr and get into the conversation. So thank you. Take it away.
Thanks for joining. Looking forward to engage. Like Dave said, we do have a presentation, but let's make it more of a working discussion, because we'd love to hear like what you guys are seeing from a market perspective too as well. We'll give you an idea of what we're seeing and what our customers or clients are telling us and some of the market research that we've done, but would love everybody's insights and feedback too as well, or validation, either or.
Yeah, so as Jana said, we started in 2018 kind of on some insights from our years at Nike, where we've all worked so deep in our supply chain to really get partners to understand priorities, onboard priorities, so that we can all elevate. And so we really focus on apparel, footwear, accessories, materials, that supply chain. And our goal is to be seen as the operational experts in that space in footwear and apparel. Bob, you want to talk about our team a little?
So just a little bit about the team. So Jana did a great introduction to Dave and myself. We're the two principals of the group. We do have a couple other people that are partners within the organization. So Lee and Annette. And then we've got, that's 4 of the group. We have a team of about 10 from an organizational standpoint. Probably half between footwear, half between apparel. And really our focus is really from materials all the way through logistics and delivery, right? So based off of our experience, you'll hear us talk a lot about sourcing, you hear us talk a lot about supply chain, product development, process design and execution. So we really run the gamut in this space. We have a couple different groups that we work with if we want to be able to do end to end. And for us, we've got 2 ways in terms of how we operate, right? We are based off of our clients. We're either doing strategic work with them and solutioning on supply chains. We also run supply chains for people as well. So we've had a few groups reach out and ask, hey, we're really good at the product side. We're not great at actually managing the supply chain side. Will you come manage our supply chain from beginning to end? So we do that as well as a service offering for the groups, or we do individual service offerings based off of the service model that Dave will share with you here.
Yeah. So quickly, our mission, we seek and intend to transform apparel and footwear supply chains. We want them to be profitable, innovative, dynamic, and digital. Pretty straightforward. I don't think we need to dwell too much on that. But again, we learned from the swoosh how to try to be brief and get into it. So if you look at some of our services, this is not by any means meant to be a full list, but kind of the main places we see ourselves providing value these days, whether it's sourcing and resiliency, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as one of the key factors impacting supply chains right now. Nearshoring and reshoring will also be one of those slides. But we do see a lot of need and request for support right now in supply chain planning and S&OP. Of course, everybody knows about inventory issues plaguing the industry, and a few companies feel like they've been a little bit asleep at the wheel when it comes to planning. So we're working with some amazing people to really drive that into the industry. Product development is about as far upstream in the product creation process as we go. We've got affiliations with designers and product management folks, but within our core competencies, product development is about as far up the product creation stream as we go. Material development as a service for the supply chain. And for those of you who know Annette Herboth, one of our partners, she's been doing material development for 30 plus years and is one of the industry best. We also help with process design and execution. So what we knew at Nike is the game plan calendar, 18 months. It's shocking to us, even to this day, to find how many companies are multi-million dollar, approaching billion-dollar companies and have very, very poor process design and execution, and just need some of that support. And then kind of more of the strategy work, whether it's org strategy and design or supply chain strategy and development and deployment, will help out groups with that as well.
Yeah, the only thing I would say here too is that this changes pretty frequently just based off of our customer base, our clients. A lot of people are asking us for a number of different services that Dave said, hey, aren't on this. These are the key ones, but we continue to evaluate really on a quarterly basis. Hey, just what are our clients really asking for? Do we have the service model set up to make sure we are the experts in this space? And then how do we serve, right? Much like from our Nike days, our customer is ultimately the key person for how we drive business.
So, okay, let's get off of the Zefyr marketing and into the topic for today. We were asked to talk about sustainable supply chains. And, you know, as we go through the day, I want you to think about how we're defining sustainable. Right now, we're going to talk about it more broadly than just environmentally protective and regenerative. Right now, we're going to talk about it more broadly than just environmentally protective and regenerative. We're going to approach it as both sustainable in terms of environmental safety and health, but also sustainable in terms of resiliency and reliability to deliver what you need on time and full. So we're going to talk about 4 key areas: partnerships, sourcing risk mitigation, ethical sourcing, and traceability and transparency. If there are any other questions, you know, that you want to talk about, we'd be happy to get into that. I saw a question come across already a little bit about emerging technologies. We're going to try to weave some of that into those 4 slides, but if we don't get to it, you know, feel free to shout out.
Sure.
Okay. Any questions before we roll into that?
Not at this point.
Cool. All right. Bob's going to walk you through our thoughts on partnership.
Yeah, so hey, this is really part of our DNA, and I think what you've seen continue from everybody's days at Nike. I think we see collaborative partnerships really at the root of building a sustainable supply chain, right? Whether it's through transparency, you know, being authentic in terms of how you partner, whether that's with a tier 1 or a tier 2 supplier, and being completely honest. I think from our last 3 years, we've seen brands, factories, and tier 2s that sit within a range of areas in this space. Ones we've seen succeed the most or continue to develop their business, whether it's a brand or factory or tier 2, are the ones that are truly trying to be, you know, honest and ethical in terms of how they deal with their different customers that they work with. And everything should be based off of a win-win philosophy, right? So whether that's engagement in terms of cost framework, whether it's engagement in terms of how you treat your workers and the impact on what you're trying to do there, Those are all absolutely critical in terms of creating this whole idea of collaborative partnerships. The other thing that we see is, hey, a lot of groups are really starting to dive deep in terms of investments. So if I'm working with a factory and I want to be able to grow them 20 to 30% over the next 3 to 5 years, sharing that strategy, being very, authentic in terms of what you want to be able to do them, whether that's grow additional capability, capacity, whether that's, adding additional machinery and capability in that space. Just how do you want to work between brand and manufacturer, or manufacturer and brand, in terms of how you're servicing them. So we see this as absolutely critical in terms of driving and developing supply chain. We have seen a few partners in this space, or a few clients in this space, that haven't done this, that have really had a hard time really trying to figure out how they're going to grow their supply chain, right? They're not sharing a 3-year strategy. They are not really getting into what they need from that manufacturing partner. And then they're coming up short, and then trying to figure out, hey, what is their backup plan? Where are they going to move to actually build additional scale? And, what you could serve with, say, 3 manufacturing partners, they're at 5 or 6, right? So their manufacturing supply chain's actually growing broader than what they really needed to be. So communication, absolutely critical. How you partner with them, how you share that vision, and then how do you actually share, what that investment growth is going to be between both partners, in order to drive that, whatever, 20 to 35% growth that you want to be able to deliver.
The other thing I'll say here, just to tag on to Bob a little bit, is we've got a client right now that is, total lack of trust and loss of trust. And we're just seeing a more contentious relationship show its head over the last 3-4 years, that, just kind of solidifies, look, how are we collaborating? How are we getting into win-win situations? So
And I
don't know if any of you are seeing that.
Yeah, I think just to tag on that too, Dave, is I think what we also see is, hey, once you get branded from an industry standpoint, the manufacturers talk. It's a small world out there, whether it's apparel or footwear. Once you get branded as kind of that non-partner value, a more transactional piece, people will let them know. And then when business starts to grow, typically those are the brands that are getting dropped first, right? So you have a risk on both sides, whether it's the brand or whether it's the manufacturer, in terms of being able to execute and being honest in terms of how you drive that. So critical in that space from what we see.
So, Bob and Dave, in your conversations from the manufacturer side, not the brand side, what would you say their top 3 asks have been with their brand partners?
I think that there's, and Dave, you can jump in too as well, but I think that there's a few things. So one, I think that there's a lot of brands that are in that $100 to $300 million zone that are growing incredibly quick, that aren't sharing further out strategy, right? It's more like, hey, here's what the next 6 months looks like. And factories trying, if you think about what factories have to be able to do to get new machinery, scale, be able to add that production and those people, absolutely critical. I think that they're also asking, hey, what do we have to be able to do in order to maintain and drive a better and a better business between the partners? So making sure that, hey, factory and brand are really clear on their goals, whether it's, how, what's going on from a worker standpoint, how the workers are being paid. It could be around sustainability, just being really good about, hey, where you're at in terms of what are the goals that the brands are expecting from their manufacturers. And then I'd say the last piece, and Dave will touch on this in a few slides, is just transparency. Where is the supply chain being made? How are you protecting the brand, right? And the manufacturers understanding, hey, where their supply chain actually is being sourced from, and can they really trace it back to farm?
Yeah, I mean, maybe layering over what Bob already said, but I think what factories want, and what I'm seeing from our former employer, is what do we mean by partnership? How are we going to define that, and how are we going to commit to it? There's been a lot of flip-flopping over COVID on commitments to quote unquote partners versus non-partners. And how are we going to maintain robust orders in good times and bad? So I think they just really want that definition, or as Bob was kind of saying, the transparency. What are we to you, and how are we committed to each other? I don't know, Charlie, what are you seeing out there?
Well, actually pretty much the same thing. And I had an Indian factory partner that came up, and I was mapping out the next 6 month, forecast and direction we were going, and explaining why, everybody, especially the factories, had the bonanza of 2022.
Yeah.
Couldn't get enough orders. And then a lot of us, a little overzealous on the forecasting and cutting back to right size inventory. But his comment was, how could so many smart brands be so stupid? That was a direct comment. And I just had to laugh. I was like, yeah, if I had that question, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. I'd be retired now. What I've always tried to do is give them a year plan, give them a rotating 3 month, but map out product category direction and where I see the growth and where I don't. And kind of, I always give them 2 to 3 key points that in order for this to happen, here's what I need from your end. And, that's still very basic, quality is always on top, delivery is always second, and then costing is, a close third. Sometimes costing goes to the top based off of, the price point, but, finding the key to all this is transparency, good and bad, and don't hide anything. If share the good, but even more so, expound on the bad, so they understand that, hey, we're going to get through a down period together, as opposed to just one of us suffering.
Yeah. Anybody else seeing anything out there with manufacturing partners?
Yeah, I can Dave, share my experience with Columbia Sportswear. Back during COVID-19 and after COVID-19, we had to cancel orders, which, is not the best time to do it, but we were basically had very tough conversation with our suppliers and factories. And then when demand came back in summer of 2021, and we didn't have enough capacity because factory were ramping up workers and reopening lines, it was a struggle. And probably was factory just sort of pick their customers, and they say, well, the one that supported COVID-19 by postponing the orders and not canceling were the number one number one brand to be back in production line. The other one were second or third, and that's basically what happened. Now it's a different story because they are over capacity, but the trust was, for Columbia and Sorel was a challenge with our biggest customers, from a retail point of view, but also with our factories, and just building back the trust was, as I said on my chat, a challenge. So it takes time and commitment from the brand to say, here's our 3 years plan, here's what we're going to do in the next 24 months, here's our investments, and like you describe your cycle. But yes, especially when you work, there's 2 points. One is when you work with big manufacturing group like Hongfu and Pouchen and Fang Tai and those guys, you're the smaller player. Seriously, Columbia is like 1.2% of their total revenue. When you work with a smaller factory, then that's a different discussion, because you are over 60 to 80% of the total productions. Then the trust factor is much higher with those smaller factory than with the big group. So there's a distinction between, that approach when you build trust as well.
A great call out.
Thanks, Eric. So the next thing, that we're really focused on and thinking about these days, as everyone is, I'm sure, is just risk mitigation. If we look out at geopolitical and global economic factors, whether it's China, Ukraine, pandemics, right? We need to be making those assessments and making plans to mitigate any of that risk. A lot of that then takes the form of manufacturing country of origin diversification. I would argue, and maybe Bob would disagree, but I think apparel's pretty good at this relative to footwear. Just in a lot of different countries around the world. But we're working pretty hard, pretty strongly with a number of brands and groups on nearshoring, especially in Mexico for footwear. But even Bob's got a client in apparel looking in Mexico. I know the Swoosh was looking at Central Europe until the Ukraine war broke out. And again, we tend to think in black and white. It's either nearshore or not. 80% of footwear is still going to be made in Asia. So it's how and what are you going to nearshore, and how do you enable responsive business models, replenishment, which Bob created with and for Nike apparel, enable speed to market, and enable the decreased reliance on huge inventories because you can replenish it so much more quickly. I think this is also about collaborative performance review. How does everyone get a shared view of their performance and a voice in that conversation so that everybody's aware of and seeing from the same page where our risks are? And then, on this last bullet point, we thought about creating an individual slide on data itself, but in the end, we bucketed it under risk mitigation, clean, reliable data, having access to software to make better informed decisions. All of that is going to help bring your risk down. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of risk mitigation.
Yeah. Two additional points there, right? So when I think somebody was asking about the software side. So, hey, how is AI going to be used in this space, right, to do better in terms of forecasting? And then how do people interpret that data or trust that data and that information? So we're pretty interested to see exactly, hey, what starts to spawn out of that. A lot of people are talking about how AI is going to help kind of solve some of the forecast accuracy challenges in terms of how does it look at the market, how does it look and build predictability in that space, whether it's, whether you've got big sales that are consistently at every time, every year in terms of how you drive it, or future issues that you see coming down the road and the recommendations that it's trying to make ahead of time, right? As you guys know, in most manufacturing is somewhere between 4 and 6 months. So you've got to really be on top of what your forecast looks like as you're buying. I would say that the other piece that's interesting that I'm interested to see what happens when Dave talks about Central America, right? So Central America probably does 10% of the apparel globally in the world today. But it has probably some of the biggest opportunity, like Dave was saying, not only Mexico and Central America and parts of South America, but until they develop the material supply chain and you have some money that's really put into that, it's really, to Dave's point, right? It's a lot of basics goods in that space. So how do they solve that? Who's going to be the investment arm really to make a difference or impact there? Because it has a huge workforce and a pretty good workforce in terms of sewing and execution, but a really poor materials and yarn space, partners in that space to really have significant growth.
Yeah, you all may know this, but the heart of footwear in Mexico is León in the state of Guanajuato. And that state government reached out to us to say, how do we attract more tier 2 and eventually more tier 1 factories to León, to Guanajuato? Because they know that they're in a competition right now with India. A lot of brands are starting to look at India. India's got a lot of attractive things going on. The government is offering a lot of incentives, and they're trying to compete and trying to figure out, how do we message Mexico as a better alternative than India? So a lot of interesting stuff happening in that nearshoring space right now. And it's funny too, how short our memories are getting in relation to COVID. So our former brand had been putting the pedal to the metal on India and Mexico, and have taken their foot off the pedal now quite a bit. Part of that's due to supporting their existing partners and wanting to make sure that they keep them full before they start going into other countries and other source locations. And part of it, I think, is, as we know, like, all right, there is no pandemic anymore. What's our worry? And a little bit of short memories there.
But as you say, the base, there's a couple of things that I think really make Mexico, and somewhat even Brazil. We get a decent amount of product out of Brazil, but it is material availability. From our end, leather's not the issue, but as you get further into molded EVA, into engineered mesh, and and different constructions outside of China, Vietnam, and Indonesia, that's really, the material support industry is not there.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
the product creation time out of a number of those locations also is extended because of them having to have an extended supply chain.
But Charlie, can I ask you a question? Because I've been meaning to ask somebody a question. You were in the region when Nike first went into Vietnam.
Yes, and the biggest thing is, most of the materials at that time were coming from China.
So that was my thought as well, and I that was my suspicion. Like, there was no material infrastructure in Vietnam when we first started going in there.
Not. And then, the flag goods came first, then, the bottom capability. But what you had, and is when Nike went in, we went in with existing partners, pretty much. Probably 80% of it were all with existing partners until we started growing. But they were either Taiwanese or Korean-based partners to start with.
Yeah.
And with that, they brought their material base, they kept it either in Taiwan or China or Korea until those same partners set up a more local base. So you would have your new innovation still coming out of the home country, but their base material starting to come out of Vietnam.
Yeah, here's the other thing, Charlie, that I think about as well, which is, when we first went into Vietnam, we didn't go in sourcing the Jordan 10 or whatever the latest Jordan was at that time. You start simple and you build up slowly as material availability, as skills, right, become more mature in that country.
Well, if you realize that probably starting out of there, good 75% was entry to mid price point running.
Yep. So there's strategies behind that as well. How do you go into Mexico? And this is footwear specific. When there are not all of the capabilities local.
And something that I would highly recommend, and something that we've used even more so with COVID is what I call local for local. In other words, that we are asking, because of the cost and instability of the supply chain during COVID, and now more so cost driven, but having our manufacturing partners present to us the material source basis. You know, where can you get your leather? Where can you get your roll goods? Where can you have engineered mesh?
Yep.
Where do we have mold making? Where do we have bottom suppliers, etc.? So that's really going in with a partner. They need to be able to present that to you. Now, you may be speccing all that, but highly recommend that they have those on-ground relationships before anybody goes into a new factory.
Yeah. The other thing I talk about is, how do you design for Mexico? How do you design for the materials that are there? You know, or 90–80% of the materials that are there, and minimize what you need to import in those early days. Anyway, all good stuff.
Can I ask one question here on this one? Is anybody seeing any really sourcing in Africa, right? So we have a couple clients that we've been talking to in that space, but it's super untapped. You know, infrastructure issues, worker training issues. I mean, there's a whole lot of work in order to build up that skill set. But is anybody seeing anything kind of on, you know, the last continent of being able to develop manufacturing with?
Yeah, you know, you can get some pretty cost competitive entry level leather shoes out of there. But once again, outside of leather, a lot of sheepskin and what the diversity of materials, the vast majority need to be brought in.
Yeah.
Well, Bob, I would mention that you might observe this more on the apparel space than the footwear space, but you start to see country of origin, Mauritius, Madagascar, not necessarily continental Africa, but certainly offshore Africa, which might be tied more to Indian influence than African influence, but it's getting closer to that continent, if you will, more from the apparel side. And to echo what Charlie says, a limited area of development in Africa from what I've seen on the footwear side.
Yeah. I mean, the closest country, Egypt, is booming, right? But all the other African countries seem to be a work in process or a heavy lift today.
And I've heard much more noise about Morocco and Jordan lately.
Yes.
Yeah, Jordan.
Well, Jordan's always been there for apparel and has been for a number of years. Huge sock, huge woven industries.
Yeah, huge with Under Armour too. I know Under Armour's got a big presence in Jordan. That's a good call too.
I just want to add to Kevin's comments. Morocco is pretty strong for Europe, so lead time and material is sourced locally. I believe Decathlon has opened a footwear factory in Morocco this year, so they're going to produce footwear there. And as you know, that's the #1 brand from Europe, and they are building that factory. In Eastern Africa, that's the reverse. People are living there because of the current situation. As we know, the war and logistic challenges. But the North African countries, yes, booming for Europe for sure. Yeah. More into this region.
Yeah. Okay.
Hey, on this, and we'll go to the next slide in just one second, but on this, you know, source country diversification, I'm also starting to hear a lot more chatter about USA based manufacturing for footwear. There's 3 or 4 footwear factories coming online. Pensole has just created a partnership up in the Northeast. There's a couple down in one in Georgia and one in Mississippi. So interesting to see how that develops as well. Of course, there has been footwear manufacturing in the US, but you just haven't heard as much about it, and I'm just starting to hear more. Ethical sourcing.
So I think that this is probably like the hottest space where people continue to engage and continue to get a ton of information. But if you see what's going on in China as an example, in Ugar with the situation there, and cotton being called out as a no-go coming into the US. We see a few things go on here. So just fair trade, right? Whether it's energy, water, and waste optimization. I'm not going to talk a lot about that. I think that we've seen that all for a number of years, and people continue to take a look at this. And there's 1,000 different groups that are working in this space. But what I will say is on the fair trade and ethical side, we continue to see a lot of government regulation coming in this space, whether it's US, whether it's Europe, whether it's by state, right? California is developing a lot of different interesting propositions that they have in that space, or what companies have to be able to call out. New York is doing some of that work too as well. So huge focus that we see coming, and Dave will talk about that from a transparency standpoint. We do see a lot of factories really looking at certification, whether it's fair trade, blue sign, ISO, social and label convergence, people who can help legitimize or give them credit. The downside of that, right? I was just reading a big article this morning coming out of the Sourcing Journal on a group called Sheen. If you guys have been watching this organization called Sheen, they're a huge e-commerce group out of Asia who's literally exploding. Their growth is 60 to 70% per quarter, and they're doing according to the article, they're doing a ton of work to try and take a look at, hey, how do they make an impact and where is it at? Counter to that, right? You've got groups coming out and saying, okay, great. You're trying to help with deforestation. You're trying to use recycled polys. You're trying to take a look at how you consume less water. But the fact that you're, shipping out, millions and millions of units at $10 a piece, that's really going to be short-term use and then right back into the environment or into a waste location. There's this huge kind of issue where what companies are doing and trying to get credit for and what people are calling out is going to be an interesting space, we think, from what we see today. So ethical sourcing, absolutely critical, but I think what we are still trying to figure out from a client and customer base, hey, how do you call it out? How do you get credit from it? And what do people believe today based off of the misinformation that's really out there between brand and market? And even the customer.
Yeah, and I'll add a few things in there as well. Like, I think we've all heard of LCA's, life cycle analysis. We see this becoming more and more of a thing in the industry. What we've seen in the past is, people are throwing noodles against the wall and seeing which ones stick. So I'm going to go to recycled boxes as a way to show my environmental responsibility. It's funny, I've been working with another former Nike gentleman by the name of Eric Brody, who started a company called Shift Advantage, consulting on sustainability in footwear and apparel. And he provided a slide to me. I didn't include it in this because it's his slide, but we also talk a lot about what happens to your footwear after you're done using it, and how do we recycle, or how do we revitalize? The industry is now showing that the carbon footprint of a used piece of shoe, or used piece of footwear, excuse me, is 0% of its overall carbon footprint. So where your impacts are, and finding that out and utilizing life cycle analysis is super important to target and drive your efforts, because what you might be spending a ton of time and energy and emotion working on may have very little impact to your overall carbon scores. So I think that's becoming more and more prevalent. The other thing I would say is, and this is just a reminder for us all coming from Nike, design plays such a huge role in things like waste optimization and environmental stewardship. I'll never forget my Nike days, you know, design signals intent. And it has to start up there. So that really helps out the entire supply chain.
Hey, guys, I got a question. Can you comment a little bit on your observations on brands starting to assign a carbon footprint score to their products? And how transparent are they on that? Because I have seen one case where one particular brand got called out for greenwashing as they quoted a very low carbon footprint score on the product, but it didn't account for how convoluted their supply chain was, from raw materials to milling to assembly to transshipping to final destination. So they omitted one large chunk of their whole supply chain strategy and focused only on the product itself. And I don't know where you've seen progress on the full extent of assigning a carbon footprint or emission score to a product.
You know, it's funny. I teach this course, Sustainable Supply Chain, at the University of Oregon Sports Product Management here in Portland. And we had the conversation yesterday, Kevin. On the one hand, I think we've all got to be proud of how far our industry has come since we started at the swoosh. Now, we're not perfect, and neither are some of these carbon scores that people are assigning, but it's causing the conversation to happen, right? And it's improving the future. So what worries me more is this new phrase I heard for the first time earlier this year called green hushing. Yeah. Right. I don't know if you guys have heard the phrase or not, but it's being so criticized publicly about what you're trying to do and what you're trying to say about your brand, that the preference is that I'm just not going to say anything. And we're not going to have those conversations. And now we're sweeping things under the rug rather than bringing them to the light. So my preference personally would be that we continue to have things like carbon scores and have the conversations of what they mean. And yeah, they're not perfect, but let's also not greenwash the consumer either. Let's talk about it openly and transparently. That's my take. Anybody else?
Let's be realistic with this. You know, J&M, we do not have the resources in order to track a complete carbon footprint. I mean, you know, it's look how long it's taken somebody the size of Nike to build up that organization just to be able to do that. Doesn't mean that, you know, we don't have initiatives that we're driving, but if you look at where the footwear and somewhat the apparel industry, a lot of brands just don't have those resources to do that.
Charlie, though, it's interesting. I don't disagree. I mean, I don't know J&M at all, but I know you guys use a lot of leather, and I've been working with Prime Asia. I'm working with another suede tannery. They're doing their own LCAs, and I wonder how some of our brands could leverage what we know about everything in their carbon footprint to bring to the brand itself.
Yeah, and that's all of our tanneries have to be certified, and that's where we start with that. And we are piggybacking onto their success in reduction of their carbon footprint and their wastewater management and moving away from chemical-based tanning into more vegetable-based tanning. Yeah. So utilizing that, and it's our whole target is to use gold-rated only tanneries.
Yeah.
Well, but even that, I would just say there's just so much information out there today. There's always somebody who's like the counter on that space.
Oh.
So how are you connecting with your customer, right? There's another great article on this group called Nine Line Apparel. It's a US apparel group. They just had a couple of their shipments stopped because of the Ugar cotton.
Eager, yeah.
Yeah, their CEO reached out to where they were getting their blanks from Next Level Apparel, who threatened to sue them if he came forward and said anything or pinned anything on them. So he actually did a DNA test on the cotton, and then he used social media to frame it up in terms of, dropping them as a future blank manufacturer, but really calling out like, hey, they are trying to do the right thing as they start to figure it out, and making sure that the companies that are in that space that are not following government regulation, they're trying to put the pressure on them too as well. So
Absolutely, Bob. That's where it's got to start.
Yeah.
But it needs to start with when you number one, the transparency with your tier 2 suppliers, and
Yeah.
then their ability to trace where it is. Where on our apparel side, we do not source any cotton from China, period.
Yep.
Don't even, even if it's from a certified farm, because the government will, if you cannot verify that it is not virgin cotton, in other words, in the ginning process, it has not been contaminated.
Yeah.
With something, yeah.
So the easiest way there is then you don't use China cotton. I mean, and that's tough.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and that's kind of our last slide where we're getting into right around traceability. And I've had the great fortune to be on an advisory board for a traceability startup here in Portland. And I've just learned a ton about all of the different language, the confusions, the regulations. You guys are seeing it, I'm sure. If you're not, you should start digging into it. We've got a partner in London who has done a ton of research for us on the diverse global country, state, and local definitions and laws that are coming out there. They're quite, like you said, Charlie, challenging and scary. But the customer and the consumer really decides, and we've got to continue to obsess, what do they care about and why do they care about it? My wife claims she's quite concerned about some of this stuff, but she can't trace down every product she purchases at a grocery store, to see whether the palm oil was coming out of a risky country. So it is about transparency, it's about traceability and providing visibility to the correct stakeholders at the correct time, whether it's Customs and Border Protection, whether it's your own planning and sourcing teams, whether it's activist shareholders who need to see or want to see some of the information deeper into your supply chain. And this gets back to kind of mitigating your risks and controlling the narrative out in the marketplace. Are you transparent or are you not? I mean, I don't think any brand wants to get seen in the news these days as being obfuscating anything about their supply chain. And then, we talk, the last bullet point there is around circularity, where we're seeing it in cotton right now. In some ways, Charlie, again, I'm sure you're seeing it in leather, and whether or not that leather is being grown, or the beef is being grown in fields that have deforested the Amazon out of Brazil. The next place we see it going is recycled fibers. Are you really using recycled fibers, circular fibers? And how can we trace and track that and really report on that accurately? So we're doing a number of pilots right now. One in suede leathers out of Vietnam, another with laces out of Indonesia, just to drive how far back we can go in the supply chain to get the information. And then how and where do you store that? It's amazing how much resistance still remains out there.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's kind of the
You know,
four. Go ahead, Charlie.
I'll put a little punch, for any of those that are, the FDRA is having a sustainability conference in Portland. And for those that have not signed up or not, FDRA does a fantastic job as an industry leader, and spokesperson in general for all, footwear brands. But excellent educational opportunity for folks that want to get a little more sounded in this. It's coming up in mid-September.
Cool. That's good. I don't think I knew that, Charlie.
Hey, Dave,
Great to know.
since the word popped up on this slide, government, do you find any correlation with this onshoring or nearshoring with government-sponsored investment schemes? I know that Tamil Nadu state in India has thrown a lot of support towards the people like Hong Fu Feng Tai, Hao Chin to come to that part of India. With your recent experience in Leon, have you seen the Mexican government, or perhaps even here in the United States, since we mentioned it, or anywhere in the world, how involved does a government investment program need to be to incentivize people to reshore, nearshore, whatever you want to call it?
So I'm going to give a really generic, broad answer to that, Kevin, because I don't know the details. But I do know that both the Mexican and the US government are investing a ton of money to support nearshoring. Now, with the US government, it's, mission critical stuff. It's microchips and some pharmaceuticals. But that's also having a halo effect, I believe, into the footwear and apparel industries. As I said, the state of Guanajuato is really trying to figure out what they need to do to be competitive and how they can support the tier 2s and the tier 1s moving there. So again, not long on details, but I think it's happening near shore, US and Mexico, and I think it's critical.
Mexico definitely is investing.
Yeah.
The government's investing to get businesses moved there. A lot of tier 2 material vendors, because that's really, the leather's not the issue, it's everything else.
Right.
Mexico's biggest problem, from what my partners down there are telling me, is that there is decades of mistrust of North American brands coming down there and not fulfilling their promises, in some cases not even paying their bills. And so there's a rift between what they consider old school thinkers and trust versus some of the younger, maybe second generation sons and daughters of owners that are starting to take over, that think about partnership differently, that think about sustainability differently, that want to really make nearshoring successful for everyone. And so I think that's going to be one of the big hurdles to overcome, is how do you get rid of some of the old thinking? Because the government will be working with, local and state boards and groups, and those are largely populated by some of the older generation.
Interesting. Thank you.
And I would say that just on the Mexico side, from an apparel standpoint, each state is a little bit different in terms of what they're offering from incentives to attract people. Right. So we've been doing a ton of work with a Chinese supplier that is going to come to Mexico for apparel, and the cost framework around it. And what we find is each state to state is offering something a little bit different in terms of the incentives that they're providing in that space, which to drive it. But I would say that what Dave was talking about earlier too, Mexico is getting a lot of interest in terms of being the next chip supplier too as well. So we've used like a lot of the investments from the US are coming back into the US. They're also going south of the border too as well, to make sure we protect our broader interest in terms of, a growing chip market based off of AI kind of being the next big push in the whole GPU versus a CPU chip that's developing out there.
I'm pretty sure Kamala Harris was down in Mexico recently, right? Talking about investments in nearshore manufacturing.
Yeah, I know that Colombia has been talking with some of the government officials, because I know that Stan was just back in DC having some conversations with the groups.
Well, we've done some production in Mexico, but was not very successful in footwear.
Yeah, we were talking, Eric, we were talking with the new footwear group over there about how they can maybe be more successful. And to the points that I think are being made here, a lot of it hinges on tier 2 availability.
Correct.
But again, they want to go in and make an existing model that has been done already in Vietnam and try to replicate that in Mexico. And I'm not sure, you know, like that's the equivalent of trying to take a Jordan into Vietnam when we first went into Vietnam.
Exactly right.
How can we
That
start a
was-
little more simple,
Yeah,
design with and for Mexico, and grow the business with them over time, and really learn how to use it for replenishment, speed to market, responsiveness, and lowered inventories.
Yeah.
I think you've got to go in there with that kind of strategy and mindset. And that's ultimately, I think, what screwed Nike when they went in with Flextronics. They weren't thinking that way either.
Yeah, you're right there. That was the
Other than going in with somebody that didn't understand shoemaking, but other than that, it was a great idea.
Well, Charlie, and they were trying to take, I know, because I was involved in this, we were doing Nike Free, which is one of the more complex bottom, you know, making. And it's like, well, no, if I had to do that over again, it would be Air Force Ones, a lot of leather, simple construction. You're selling tons of them. So do it from a replenishment standpoint and just send 5,000 pairs a day into the North American market to replenish white, black, you know, and start that way. But, you know, that's history. We learn from it and see what happens.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, this has been such a great conversation. Thank you for joining in, Shelby and Eric and Charlie and Justin, to kind of, you know, this has been a super fun to listen, because you know, being in the consumer space, I was thinking about things a little bit differently. So this was great. I just want to thank you, Dave Kelley and Bob Jones, for spending some time with us, spending some time to think about the conversation. I encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to sign up to receive their newsletter. It's really super informative. A couple upcoming events. June 23rd, we're going to be hearing from Charisse Thornhill Goldson and Jessica Smith, founders of the SEED program, breaking down barriers for young creatives. And then July 19th, we're doing our it is our all membership meeting for 6453, and so it's our State of the Union. You can hear what we've been up to and what we're planning. So hopefully more events like this, not only on Zoom, but in person. So thank you again for joining us today, and appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for
Absolutely.
having us. Great to reconnect with all our old friends and see the faces. Love it.
All right. Have a great day,
All right.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bob's
Thank
already
you.
left, but look forward to connecting in when I'm back, Dave.
Yeah, please do.
See where we can take this.
Yeah, that would be awesome, Charlie. I'll try to connect with you offline.
Sounds good. Everybody
All
have a great day.
Take
Bye-bye
care.
now.
Nice to see
everybody.
you.
Everybody.